Welcome to Bea Bruske, recently elected president of the Canadian Labour Congress and a graduate of the Labour Studies program at the University of Manitoba. So congratulations, Bea, on your incredible new position. We're just so thrilled, and thank you so much for agreeing to this interview.
Thank you.
Can you tell me to start how you think your degree in Labour Studies helped shape your career path and maybe what advantages Labour Studies as an education gave you?
Absolutely. I came to the labor studies, to taking labor studies courses at university after I was involved in a labor dispute with my employer, Superstore at the time, when I was an 18-year-old, and decided that labor studies sounded way more interesting than becoming a teacher. So I decided to go down that particular path, and I have never looked back. I've always found it absolutely incredibly interesting, and standing up for the rights of workers is a privilege, and it's work that is difficult at times. It's very challenging, but it's always rewarding. And in my mind, my labor studies arts degree really provided me with an opportunity to understand the broader context of the labor movement. So while I was always very active within my local from an early age, what I didn't get from that activism was what the U of M labor studies program gave me, which was to understand the labor movement as a whole, to understand our history, because if we don't know our history, we don't know where we're going, of course, and to also really understand, the fact that we are part of a larger movement. When you're working within a union, it's really hard to have blinders on to a certain extent and just be focused on your own internal issues and the industries that you're working within, the members that you're representing who work within those industries. Whereas, the labor studies program gave me that opportunity to understand the many different facets of the movement in terms of how labor councils work, federations of labor, how various different affiliates work, why they take different positions on different issues. So it really gave me that really well-rounded knowledge that I use today still.
Wow, thank you. Well, it's great to hear you say that, you appreciate the importance of history. As a labor historian, I think, if we don't know where we came from, we don't know where we need to go. So thank you for that plug for history, often overlooked. So there have been a lot of changes lately, not just at the head of the CLC, but things that have had a profound effect on Canadian workers. So how do you plan to respond to those new challenges and, of course, the ongoing challenges that labor is also facing?
Yeah, I think as much as there are new challenges, the core challenges within the labor movement have remained the same for a very long period of time. And my team and my team was called Team Unite for a reason. We were three women coming from different union backgrounds. I came from a large private sector background. My other teammate, Lily, comes from CUPE, a very large, of course, public sector, worked in fact in the largest CUPE local in the country. And Siobhan, of course, from IATSE, very small private sector as well. But one of the things that we recognized, one of the challenges that the labor movement has had for a long time, is that we're not as unified as we need to be in order to actually push worker agenda forward, right? And so making sure that we can have good relationships with all of the affiliates, with federations of labor across the country, and with labor councils, big or small, has to be a priority for us, because if we as labor are not unified, we can't actually push anything forward. Let's be honest, right? And so making sure that we can have some really difficult internal conversations within the movement, because oftentimes our goals are the same. It's how we get to those goals that's where we differ, and that's where we have divisiveness that becomes a stalling tactic at times, or that becomes a mountain too high to climb. And so we really want to focus first and foremost on building that solidarity, on bringing people to the table, on making sure we're building those relationships within the movement, and on making sure we have those difficult conversations, and always remind ourselves and the folks that we're dealing with why we're here to begin with. So that's first and foremost what we, I think, need to accomplish. And we really also believe strongly that the lack of worker engagement within the movement is hugely problematic. And we absolutely must address that, because if union workers in particular are not active within their own organization, within their own union, and workers in Canada in general don't understand the fact that we have a labor movement and that there is someone advocating on their behalf, we can't lead people if they don't know that they're being led, right? And so we really want to make sure sure that workers are engaged, that they're understanding the issues, that we do that outreach at every possible opportunity, and that we find ways for workers to want to participate and make it easy for folks to participate. So those are kind of the overarching pieces that we feel are hugely important. And then of course there's political action. Going through this pandemic, it's really laid bare so many shortcomings of our society, right, in terms of how we value or don't value things like public services, how we value or don't value those frontline workers who we see all the time as workers but don't recognize their importance, right? Whether you're doing cashier job at a grocery store, making sure we can still get our groceries, or if you're working in a personal care home and you're the person providing the meals to residents, right? So all of those jobs that so often are forgotten about have been laid bare, that the importance of those particular jobs. So making sure that we're giving voice to those workers has to be a priority for us, and that in my mind always starts with political action.
Right. Yes. I think, we've all just become so much more aware, hopefully, of, the importance of those essential workers who are also the most likely to be unvaccinated and the victims of, of COVID-19 in this really difficult time, and who have to go to work. So how do you see, can you follow up a little bit on it? How do you see, like, the CLC doesn't actually organize workers. So what is the CLC's role, do you think, in dealing with, for instance, the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So first and foremost, the CLC does not organize workers, but I would argue that the CLC has a huge role to play in making sure that workers in Canada understand the value of unions and how belonging to a union is to their benefit, right? Because we know unionized workers do better in absolutely every measure in terms of wages, benefits, pensions, all those kinds of things. So while the CLC itself doesn't sign union membership cards for people, I think making sure that we're building that awareness among the public has to be a priority. In terms of political action, we have to make sure that we're always on the front line speaking out to whatever new bills or legislation government is going to be passing. We can't just be passively sitting by and allowing workers to be stripped of rights. In the Manitoba context, I don't have to tell you folks, in the last 4 years, the kinds of bills that we've been subjected to, right? Everything from Bill 16 in terms of employment standards review to Bill 64 on education, which some may argue is not a worker bill, but it absolutely directly impacts workers, right? Bill 28, the bargaining unit restructuring and healthcare. There's been just an ongoing attack on labor just within our own province, and making sure that we as workers, first and foremost, are at the front of the line when it comes to speaking out against these things, because we understand how it impacts workers, has to be a priority. But I would argue even more importantly than that is to rally workers in particular to understanding the implications of these various different bills, and also encouraging folks to speak out, not just leadership, but the average individual going to work every day, making sure that they are fully cognizant of the implications on their workplace, on their families, on their communities, and providing a venue for that action.
Yeah, wow, that sounds just great. It sounds like what you're telling me is that, you want labor movement to be once again a grassroots movement.
It has to be. It has to be. We need to actually engage folks, and we need to have active participation. That's the only way this works. So it can't just be, the officers of the CLC speaking out against things. It has to be encouraging participation at every level and growing our connections with other communities as well. Non-unionized workers, other equity-seeking groups. We have to do that work. It's hugely critical.
Right. Okay, great. That's just, and it's also, I think, good for us to be reminded somehow that teachers are workers, just as,
Absolutely.
Just as professors are workers. We sort of like to think of ourselves as in a different category, but, we work for pay, and we deal with an employer, and we bargain collectively. So
you've just made such an important point, and some of the unions that represent more white collar professional type of workers have reached out to me and said, "Bea, we really want to find a way to organize more white collar workers." And in my mind, if you get a paycheck that doesn't have your name at the bottom of it, you are a worker, right? Like, that is the reality. And so many times people forget that. My son just became an engineer. He just finished his studies at the university, and he's just got his first job. And I can already see, how in certain ways, there are things that I think he would benefit in terms of having a union, right? In terms of the amount of hours and the employer expectation, and, not having the ability to disconnect from his work, and all of those kinds of things that in the more professional kinds of areas, that's a legitimate and real issue that we don't often think about as a worker issue, but it certainly is a worker issue.
Right. Okay. So in terms of the kinds of things that the CLC can do, acting as like a national organization that doesn't actually deal with workers on the front line or even at the local level. And I know that the CLC has always been an advocate of gender equity. How do you see your role as you must be the first CLC woman president.
No, I'm the second, actually. I am the second. So Shirley Carr was the
Shirley
first
Carr.
woman.
Okay.
Yes, yes. And she was a QP sister, of course. And my very, very first CLC convention is the convention that she stepped down and passed the baton to Bob White. So I'm aging myself a little bit here, but I was in my early 20s when that happened. And that was my first ever union convention that I got to go to. But I really take the issue of gender equality seriously. And my team and I, one of the things that we definitely ran on was the issue of making sure that we're making space, and not just space to participate, but space to make decisions at every level. And so for me, that means when we're looking at hiring for within the Labor Congress, we need to look at it through that lens. I'm really aware of the fact that if we want to lead the labor movement, we need to look like the workers in the labor movement. And the workers in the labor movement are a very diverse gender and of course, racialized background, diverse movement, right? And if we want to actually make inroads for all workers, we need to make sure that at every position within the movement, we have workers that reflect that experience. And so making space to have really good discussion and inviting positive and negative feedback, critical feedback is also very important to us. And then making sure that we're making space to bring those folks along. So for me, that's making sure that there are mentoring opportunities, that we're actively inviting participants from diverse backgrounds, women and various different areas, right, to actively participate and encouraging that participation. It also means to me making sure that we have policies against harassment and all of those types of things that are fully enforced and quickly enforced when there's a problem. So there's a multitude of different aspects that we need to address. And often it's just making sure that we actually ask folks to participate, because so oftentimes people think, oh, I can't do that. That's not my experience, or I don't feel like I'm confident enough or comfortable enough to participate in that way. Often all it takes is asking someone once or twice or maybe 3 or 4 times to say, hey, you really can act on this committee and you bring valuable experience to this, and we need to hear from you and from this particular community. So please do participate. So that's the plan.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I'm looking forward to that. And I'm sure all the women in the labor movement, of whom there are like a majority, I think. Aren't there a majority?
We are a majority. Yeah. We are, absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so lately, of course, we've all been reminded of, the hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous students, kids who disappeared and never came home from the residential schools. And it reminds us, I think, of the ongoing issue, unresolved issues in Canada of settler colonialism, and the problems that has created for our Indigenous citizens. What's the CLC's position on how to deal with these ongoing problems in Canada?
It's horrendous, the news that we've been hearing and that we will continue to hear. I have no doubt that we will continue to hear about many more children being found, and making sure that we are an active part of reconciliation is a priority for us. So in my mind, there are 2 aspects to this. Number one, the labor movement has an obligation to act on Indigenous rights issues, just from a human rights perspective. We do human rights work with communities all over the world. And of course, we have to clean up our own backyard, so to speak, first and foremost. Secondly, if we want to truly build an inclusive movement, that means making space for our Indigenous workers as well, and finding ways to have active participation for Indigenous workers in the movement and in leadership roles in addition to. But more specifically, I think that the fact that we have the 64 calls to action and only, I think, less than 20 of them have been fully implemented, right, is problematic. So we need to make sure that we continue to push governments, provincial, federal, to implement the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls recommendations that need to be implemented. So we need to consistently be reminding government that they're failing on that particular point. And quite frankly, the fact that we can talk about sending humans to Mars, but we can't bring water to First Nations is absolutely deplorable to me. So making sure that we are always speaking out and engaging on those points has to be a priority for the movement, and we're going to be doing that.
Well, this is, I have to say, I am just so excited to hear you say this, because it signals to me, and I'm sure to many other people that, who've heard you speak, that you have an activist agenda, and the CLC is going to become much more engaged in the community than it has in the past. It's always been an important part of Canadian life, because the labor movement is part of life, but an activist agenda, I think, is going to be just so important at revitalizing our labor movement.
Absolutely, and we have to build those connections with various different communities, and it's no different with the Indigenous community. And I also think that we have work to do within various different affiliates in terms of finding ways to build in that type of education within workplaces, right? Because that doesn't happen overnight. So making sure that we provide those supports, those resources, so that at different rounds of bargaining committees can speak to Indigenous issues, right? Can speak to implementing some of the truth and reconciliation recommendations within a workplace context, right? And do the education within that workplace. That has to be a priority as well if we want to get to a better place as a society.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm just saying, I'm very inspired by this. The only thing I will say, just as ask you as a follow-up to conclude, is what advice you could give to young people today?
I think number one, collective action works, and it's more important than ever, because the folks that are wanting to have a right-wing agenda, they seek to divide us. And so we have to get over our own internal squabbles and recognize that even though we may have a different way of achieving a goal, we have to find a way to make it work on the left, and we need to make sure that we're together in how we pursue our overarching goals. And quite frankly, if you don't have union representation yet, go get it. And if you do have union representation, take advantage of that. Get actively engaged in your union. And if your union isn't going in the direction that you think it's going in, or if it's not taking on the challenges that you think it's taking on, it's incumbent upon the members within that union to voice those issues, right? So always be actively engaged. Don't ever shy away from asking tough questions. Don't ever shy away from, challenging an agenda that you don't think is the right way to go. But also be a little bit humble in how you do that, right? Because we want to build collegiality and move a way forward. But folks know way more than they give themselves credit for when they become activists, because we tend to doubt ourselves, right? And think, oh, maybe I don't know enough about this or that to ask that question. You know more than you give yourself credit for. Ask the question and just go for it.
Great. Good advice, right? Just to remind us all that, the labor movement is us and not the leaders.
Absolutely. 100%. It is us.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for giving us some of your very precious time. I'm sure you're super busy these days, and we're glad to see you working at the front lines like this. So leading the way, but thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And, good luck. I hope you're able to achieve those impressive goals, with great speed, and I'm sure you will do so with the support you've got. Thank you very much.
We've got less than 22 months for our first term, but we are hitting the ground running, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with folks. The U of M Labor Studies Department has a big part of my heart, so absolutely, anytime you need something, I'm here.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.